gonna start again. Um, I would like to continue from the sheets, so the PowerPoint presentation, which means I cannot make annotations anymore, but I have some nice videos that I can only show from my desktop and not from the tablet. Okay, so I'm basically gonna skip this slide because I want to explain in words what's going on. So first of all, I have explained to you the principle of OCT with a moving mirror. And what I'm going to show you now is a movie that was acquired with a state-of-the-art system in about 2001, 2002. Can you see it? Yes. So what you see, and now I need to get a pointer, laser pointer. So in this image, you can see I put my laser pointer in the center of the optic nerve head. What we're looking at is a system that is imaging the retina, and at the same time we film with a camera through the pupil, the back of the eye. Structures that you can see is, for instance, a red blood vessel that is here. There's a blood vessel right here. And what you also see is an OCT beam, that dot there, and following it, that makes circles around the optic nerve head, and every time it has completed one circle, and that's about when it's here, you see an update of the image below. And this is a cross-sectional image of the retina. Where my laser pointer is the top layer, and then you go into depth. This is a nerve fiber layer, inner plexiform layer, inner outer layer, outer plexiform layer, outer nuclear layer, photoreceptor layer, and RPE, retinal pigmented epithelium. And this was acquired with a speed of about 6 frames per second. 6 seconds per frame, sorry, 6 seconds per frame. So we make a circle around the retina, and every 6 seconds we have completed the circle, and we get the cross section of the retina. Show you a little bit more structure that you can visualize here. At this location is a blood vessel, and since the blood vessel absorbs the light, below the blood vessel you see a shadow where there is not enough light, so that is the white line. So dark means a lot of reflected light here actually. And you can nicely follow what the thickness of the nerve fiber looks like. But you can also imagine that this is a movie that acquires about 12 frames. Each frame is, oh, by the way, this is where you see a blink. So the person was blinking, which means that the light to the retina was blocked. That's why you don't see anything. That means that this is a measurement of about 72 seconds. That is more than a minute. And this also points to the Achilles heel of this technique, because 72 seconds keeping your eye open is actually an extremely long time, more than a minute. And I challenge you to try it yourself without blinking, and I guarantee you that after 30 to 45 seconds you get an itchy feeling and you have a strong urge to blink. So this technique would benefit tremendously from being able to scan much faster, and that is where I want to go to. I'm missing an overview of my slides. Yes. Okay. So over the past 15 years, optical coherence tomography has undergone a rapid development from inception to a versatile method for non-invasive high-resolution optical imaging. OCT needs to operate in a shot noise limit, and the potential diagnostic applications having the highest impact require screening or surveillance of large tissue volumes at high speed. So the relative low image speed acquisition of about 20 years ago, that was really preventing the technology to make a breakthrough into, for instance, imaging of coronary arteries or of Barrett's esophagus or of the lungs. All kind of applications where you want to do it very quickly. So what I want to show you now is what happens if we go and measure with a different configuration. So the top image here is the OCT system as I have explained it so far with a reference arm that moves back and forth. And this was described by Fujimoto in 1991. He's the grandfather of OCT, or instigated the whole field. But in 1995 already, so that was 4 years after Fujimoto came with this concept, Verger in Vienna came up with an alternative approach, and he said, you know what, forget about that moving mirror, let's put a fixed mirror in the reference arm, but we're going to change the detection arm. In the detection arm, we're not going to put a single detector, but we're going to put a spectrometer. We're going to put a grating in there with a lens and a detector array that can measure multiple wavelengths at the same time. So let's take a look. Oops. Let's take a look at the grating, or sorry, the spectrometer. It means we'll have the fiber from the detection arm. Using a lens, we can create a collimated beam. We use a transmission grating, which breaks up the light in different directions. So every color is sent into a different direction. And then we use a lens to image those different directions to different locations on a CCD camera. So here you can see your CCD camera, let's say 1,000 or 2,000 photosensitive elements. And you can measure now the spectrum of the light source. So let's take a look at what that spectrum looks like. And along the vertical axis is the intensity that is measured by the detector. And along the horizontal axis is the wave factor k, or in other words, 2 pi over lambda. And what we can see here, this is in the case where we actually have a mirror in the sample arm. So we measure the interference between sample and reference arm. We see a very rapid pattern oscillation of the intensity. And we can understand this in the following way. So let's take a look at the peak position here. It means that for this wavelength, the path length difference between a sample and a reference arm is an integer times the wavelength, because then the wave from the reference and the sample arm will constructively interfere and create an interference maximum. Now, if I change the wavelength a little bit, it will not fit the ideal integer number anymore on the path length difference. And so that means that the interference term, the intensity will go down, and it will go down all the way to somewhere here. And if we change the wavelength even further, we start to increase again in our intensity, and we will get at some point a new maximum. And for this new maximum, this second maximum, it means that this wavelength, which is different than the one before, but also this wavelength fits in integer times on the path length difference between the sample and reference arm. So we can cast that in a formula, and we can look at the intensity that we measure in the spectrometer as a function of wave factor. And that intensity is given by the reference arm power, IRK. It is given by that sample arm power, but we always assume that the amount of light that's reflected from the sample is really small, so we can basically ignore it. And it's given by the interference term between the sample and reference arm. And the magnitude of that interference term is the square root of the sample intensity and the reference intensity times, and here it comes, alpha n, which is the scatter cross-section at a particular depth, or the reflectivity that we discussed before, and a cosine term that is given by k times Zn. And we can see that this cosine peaks if it's equal to 2 pi, and k is equal to 2 pi over lambda. So it means that Zn, the path length difference between sample and reference arm, divided by lambda is equal to an integer. And then we get the maximum. And that explains the spectrum that we see. And now the beauty is that we can retrieve back our depth profile by doing a Fourier transformation of this intensity as a function of k. So when we do a Fourier transformation of this interference pattern that we measure at the spectrometer, I won't go through the math, but I will just show the result. What we get is a pattern where we get a very strong peak at 0. And this strong peak at 0 is basically given by the envelope of the interference pattern on the left. And we get a peak at a distance of 230 micron that corresponds to this oscillation frequency. And so we can retrieve now the same information with a moving mirror. We can retrieve that same information with a system where we have a fixed mirror and we measure the spectrum and we do a Fourier transform of the spectrum. Okay, so this is an animation now that shows you what the signal is on the detector. This detector is given below here. This is the signal that you see on the detector and on the spectrometer, basically. And this signal here is the signal that you see when you do a Fourier transform. And on the top, you see a stationary reference mirror, and you see a sample mirror moving back and forth. And you see you can nicely follow the location of that mirror. The other thing that you should observe is that there is actually a mirror image present. That's a consequence of the Fourier transform. But you also can see that this fringe pattern becomes denser and denser when the path length difference between the reference and sample arm becomes bigger and bigger. So this gives you an idea of how that information is encoded in the modulation of the spectrum. Okay, we can go now through a signal-to-noise analysis of this technique, the spectral domain. And some of the terms are looking familiar to you now, because if you look at the noise that is present in the system, and that noise is our sample and readout noise. This was equal to the thermal noise that we discussed before. We have a shot noise term, and we have that relative intensity noise term. Now, the interesting thing is, if we calculate our signal-to-noise ratio for this system, it turns out that it's equal to the quantum efficiency of our detector, the sample arm power that comes back from the sample, times the integration time of the spectrometer divided by the energy of a single photon. And this expression shows you now that the spectral domain approach of measuring the OTT signal has a signal-to-noise ratio of 1 if only one photon comes back from the sample arm. So it's really beating it really reaches the shot noise limit and gives you a signal-to-noise ratio of 1 for just one photon coming back from the sample arm. And it's hard to beat that in terms of the sensitivity. You can see that the power in the sample times the integration time, if that power is equal to the energy of one photon, we already have the signal-to-noise ratio of 1. And so this was predicted more or less in 1998 and 1999 by Mitsui, and actually experimentally demonstrated in 2003 by 3 groups more or less simultaneously. The consequence was that the sensitivity of this approach was about 2 to 3 orders of magnitude better. So that meant that we could measure 100 to 1,000 times faster and still you would be able to acquire images with the same quality as before. Normally, if you take a picture with a camera, photo camera, and you decrease the shutter time, so you decrease the exposure time of the film, the shorter you make the exposure time, the grainier the photo gets, so you lose quality. But here, it shows you that you could go 300 to 1,000 times faster, while you could acquire the same quality images as before. So this was a major breakthrough in this technology. I'm going to skip the details of this, and I'm going to go to some examples of what you could do now with it. So first of all, we're going to look at the cross section of the eye. This is well-known structures of the eye. Here you have the cornea, here you have the lens, and here you have the retina itself. Within the center, the fovea, the area where you have the highest density of photoreceptors. And here you have the optic nerve, that is where all the nerves collect and go towards the brain, and also blood vessels that come in through the optic nerve and supply oxygen to the upper layers of the retina. So the fovea is a very interesting structure because it's the only region in the eye where every photoreceptor is connected to a single nerve or to a single axon. And so that is the region where you have your vision with the highest resolution. It's in the periphery, it's multiple photoreceptors connected to a single neuron. So that means you can't really resolve what is seen by a single photoreceptor, but only in the fovea you can. So the fovea is a really important region. As an example, that is the region with which you are able to read, watch TV, recognize faces, and basically have that sharp perception of the environment around you. I don't know if you can see me, but if you can see me, if I wave my hand in the periphery, like next to my head, I'm not really aware of the shape of my hand. I cannot see it, but I'm aware of the motion that takes place there. And that is because in the periphery, it's multiple photoreceptors that are connected together, and there they actually trigger on motion, not on the sharpness of the vision. In normal class, I asked the group, how large do you think this area is with which you can see very sharp? To give you a hint, a single photoreceptor has a diameter of about 3 micron. So how large do you think that area is? Anybody? 3 microns for a single photoreceptor. Let's start with your cell phone. How many pixels in a cell phone? Million? More or less?
More. Mega is to the power of 9. Oh no, sorry.
Yeah, million is low for the number of pixels in your camera, right? But let's assume a million. So that means a million you get with the square of 1,000 by 1,000. So what do you think? How large is that area where you have one individual photoreceptor connected to a single nerve? If we assume 1,000 by 1,000 pixels that are connected, a single photoreceptor is 3 micron, so 3 micron times 1,000, that gives us 3 millimeters. Who of you think that the fovea is larger than 3 millimeters, and who thinks it's smaller? Let's do it like this. I can see about 3 of you. How about you raise your right hand if you think it's more? That's like this. And your left hand if you think it's less. That's this. So that is Let me see, where am I? So that is more, no, less, 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 more, and less. Is that correct? Or is it 4 think more? 4 think more? 4 think less. Ah, okay. So the majority is correct. That area is actually only 300 micron. So it's you have an area of 100 by 100 pixels that gives you your sharp vision. Only 10,000 independent pixels. I hope you appreciate that little area in your fovea now very much, because that allows you to function the way you can. Hey, but maybe we can see an OCT image of that area. So what we see now here in the video, if I hope you can see it, it will loop around, is a video rate OCT images of that, not of the fovea. One sec. Petra, I am teaching. I can talk to you. Yeah, it's 5:30 or 5:15. Yeah. Okay, so here you see video rate 30 frames per second of that of the optic nerve. So you see that dip. This is where all the nerves go towards the brain. If you look at, if I can get my laser pointer on, here's my laser pointer. So this black layer is the nerve fiber layer, and it really thickens and it brings all the axons to the brain for your brain to process all that visual information. You can also see blood vessels. That these are the structures that cast these shadows deeper. We can go to, because we get volumetric information, we can actually create an en face image, like I discussed before. So here we see the, so this information is created out of the three-dimensional volume, basically by squeezing it in the Z direction. And this is an image like you take a picture of the retina. You can see the blood vessels here nicely. We can see the fovea. The fovea is right here. I'll leave the marker. And then you can also see that when the white line shows you the location of the cross section, and when the white line hits that the position of my laser pointer, you can see a change in the structure of the retina. You can see, and I will go now over to this here. You can see at this location, let's wait until it's there, really a dip in the retinal layers, and that is where your fovea is. What happens here is that basically all connective tissue is pushed out of the way to expose the photoreceptors that are right here, oh, a little bit lower. So here the photoreceptors, and in the fovea, the area of your sharpest vision, all these layers above it are kind of pushed aside to maximally expose the fovea there to the light, and the only structure that is above it are these axons that go out towards the brain. Okay, so this is is this a movie? It should be a movie. Will it play? Oh, this should be a detailed. What happened? What happened? Movie 2A. Movie 2A. Okay. So you can actually see the date acquisition. No, this is not the acquisition date. Yeah, so now we have a movie that shows us in detail the fovea. There's a little delay also on my screen in going to full screen mode again and the movie, but I think this gives you the best results, yes. So here we see a scan of only the fovea. Where also we can recognize very small blood vessels. So you see these little black dots that are present in this layer, approximately here. Yes, there they are. These little black dots, these are also blood vessels. And so we have also in the image below, we have indicated the location of blood vessels based on their scattering properties. So we can get really nice detailed images of the retina. And this is an example of where we compare the retina itself, an OCT image, with histology that was obtained from a textbook. So histology, as I told you, take a small slice of tissue, stain it with a stain, in this case hematoxylin, which colors the nuclei and other structures slightly red. And so here you can see now your different layers. RPE, this is the photoreceptors. This section here, this band here, with that little line in the middle where I have put my laser pointer being the area between the inner and outer segments of the photoreceptors. Outer nuclear layer, outer plexiform layer, inner nuclear layer, inner plexiform layer, and then on the top here the ganglion cell layer and the ganglion cell layer and nerve fiber layer. So we can see we can get really nicely the structure with OCT, but definitely not down to the cellular level. Okay, so the idea is that if you have a measurement method where you split in the detection the wavelengths up in different bands, you get an incredible increase in the sensitivity. This was developing an OCT system with a spectrometer worked really well in the near infrared range, so let's say 850 nanometers, and that is also the wavelength that was used for ophthalmic imaging a lot. But if you have, as you have seen and explained by Dirk, going to the longer wavelengths, you can penetrate deeper. So there was really a need to move the OCT imaging to a wavelength of 1.3 micron or 1300 nanometers. The problem at the time was that there were no detector arrays available, or they were very limited in size. They provided a lot of noise, and so it was difficult to develop a spectrometer-based OCT system at 1.3 micron. So there, a whole new class of lasers was developed to address this issue. And the principle is as follows. Here, we use a laser that actually tunes its wavelength very fast. It tunes its wavelengths, let's say, from 1250 to 1350 nanometers, so over a bandwidth of 100 nanometer. And it does that with a speed of, let's say, 10,000 to 100,000 or even a million times per second. And in the system consists of a reference arm and a sample arm where we have a stationary mirror in the reference arm. The light of the two arms is combined in the 2x2 splitter, and the light is sent to a photoreceiver where we detect the interference between the sample and reference arm. And now, since we sweep the wavelength, we get the interference as a function of time, which is actually equal to the intensity as a function of wave number, or k. Which means that we actually have done a similar measurement as we've done with the spectrometer. We have spectrally resolved the interference patterns from our tissue. And this is also an animation. Let's see if I can get it started. Yes, there it goes. So you can see the black arrow here move. And let's try it again. But you see this black arrow move here over the spectrum, and at the same time, we see the photoreceiver signal and the interference pattern. And in the bottom graph, we do a Fourier transform of this interference pattern, and we get our depth profile. So I'll try and run it one more time. Here we go. So we sweep the wavelength, we measure the interference as a function of time, which is actually equal to wavelength, Fourier transform, and we get the depth information. And it turns out that the signal to noise advantage that we got with the spectral domain was equal for this approach, which is referred to in the literature as swept source OCT or optical frequency domain imaging. Development of these sources wasn't easy. In the beginning, they didn't exist, so a lot of groups built these homemade systems. This is one where yeah, my laser point is really slow, so I'm going to the SOA. The SOA is not what you think it is, but it's a semiconductor optical amplifier. It's a device that amplifies the incident light by a factor of 100 to 1,000. What you do is it generates a spectrum, you send it to a grating, the grating splits it up in different direction, you use a lens to image it back to a location, and with the second lens you image that back to directions. And now you have here a polygon mirror that is that rapidly rotates. So as a function of time, it reflects either back the red light or the orange light, or the yellow or the green light, as a function of the position of this mirror. And that, in that sense, that reflected light goes back to the system, hits the semiconductor optical amplifier, gets amplified, goes through what we call a loop mirror. So part of the light is reflected back to the amplifier, and part of the light comes out and can be used as a source of light for an OCT system, for a swept source or optical frequency domain imaging system. This is the development of an alternative method of a swept laser. I'm not going to go into details. If you're interested, you can find the reference at the bottom of the slide. The principle of this is basically that you take the colors are going to run through this ring, very long ring cavity in a resonant matter. It's called the Fourier domain mode-locked laser. I want to show you a little bit of the clinical implementation of these systems. So now we can acquire images at the speed of, let's say, 100 to 1,000 images per second. The latest lasers run at like 5 megahertz or so. That means 5 million depth profiles per second. And then what do you do with it? You get to the next challenge, that is actually imaging relevant tissues, and their endoscopy or catheters become really important. So the old catheters could run at the speed of 4 images per second, so that means 4 rotations per second. But if you want to image at 100 to 1,000 images per second, it means that the tip of your catheter needs to rotate at the speed of 100 to 1,000 rotations per second. And that creates its own whole new set of challenges. One option that is, I think, the most dominantly used for clinical studies is the one where you have an outer sleeve of plastic. You have an inside that outer sleeve is the optical fiber with the torque cable, which is basically a cable that rotates, and at the tip you have a mirror glued onto the rotating cable, a prism at 45, which ejects the light like this, and when that whole structure rotates, it creates as a lighthouse the beam comes out of that catheter and images the tissue. Another approach that is gaining popularity is using motorized catheters, which means that you can keep your whole fiber inside the catheter stationary, but you put a little motor at the end. That has quite some challenges because these motors are on the order of a millimeter in diameter, and building a robust, reliable motor that rotates is for these tiny miniature motors is a challenge. And lastly, you look at forward-looking probes where you are not looking sideways, but you look in the forward direction, and you try to do that with piezo cantilevers that oscillate. So the whole fiber now oscillates, meaning that it creates here an oscillation of the location where you image, and you can create a forward-looking image of the tissue. So to give you one example, this is such a clinical system, basically a card with the whole optical and the computers and all the data processing put into it. You have to realize that data acquisition becomes an issue all of a sudden too. These are data acquisition cards that acquire 400 to 1 giga samples per second. So you get insane amounts of data that need to be processed. Right now, most groups still do that offline, but also GPU processing becomes more and more popular for providing clinicians with a live view of the tissue they're imaging. And the kind of structures that you can see then, this is the esophagus of a swine. So the esophagus is the part between your mouth and your stomach, and there's a lot of interest in the lower part of your esophagus because people over 50 get, due to acid reflux from the stomach, get damage to the lining of the esophagus, which can lead to cancer. And again, if you could survey these patients early on and find the early stages of this development, then you prevent these patients from developing cancer. So this is a healthy swine, but what you can see in these images, like the layered structure that you expect for a healthy esophagus, and what you see in a esophagus that develops tumors, is that this nicely layered structure becomes more granular and pitted, showing it is basically a destruction of the normal lining of the esophagus. This is a tiny catheter that we develop in our own lab. So this is such a micromotor of diameter of 1 millimeter, and a tiny little prism that is glued on top of it. This is the motor axle. You can see the wires, and this is the fiber that brings the light to this fiber tip. And it's a movie, so when I start it, it should show you. Let's do it like this. And it should start to rotate at some point. It doesn't. Media not find. Okay, forget it. This is work that we did in our own group. This is an endoscopic OFDI of the airway of a pig. Again, media not found. Let's try. This is a movie, so let's try and find it. Or do I have? No. Pig lung bronchoscope 2. So to give you an idea, so if you can you see my pointer? No, you cannot. So these structures here are the wires that feed current to the motor. This here is the catheter sheath, where I put my pointer right now. That's in the middle of the catheter sheath, and then everything you see outside of that catheter sheath is the tissue of the big lung. And the interesting thing that you see here are these areas, these bands, like for instance right here. Oops, yeah. Right there, right there. Now I'm in the middle. These are actually cartilage rings. So this is a young pig. It has a very flexible amount of cartilage. What I will show you in my second lecture for both groups is imaging in vivo of asthma patients, where we can determine the smooth muscle layer in this airway wall. We do that by using the polarization state of light. I look forward to showing that to you. I want to end with a little bit more of retinal imaging, and I think that is here. This is how, for instance, OCT is being used in the clinic these days. This is a patient that has age-related macular degeneration. It means that there are bleeding vessels in the retina, leaking and bleeding vessels that create major problems. And so the image that I'm pointing at right now is the standard way of diagnosing AMD. This is just a fundus photo, a color photo of the back of the eye. And if you look carefully, you see these white arrows. You see one here. You see another one right approximately there. These white arrows indicate an area where the ophthalmologist has said, okay, there's something wrong in that area. There's actually a fluid membrane, and he bases the diagnosis on the slight color change. The image to the right, this one here, is a fluorescein angiography image. So fluorescein angiography is a technique where you inject a dye in the bloodstream, and at the same time you take photos of the retina, and the dye lights up the blood vessels. So what you see in this image is really bright blood vessels like this one here. And the nice thing of this technique is, first the arterials arterion light up, and after that the veins. So you can actually distinguish what's an artery and what's a vein. What it also shows, and this is, I go to the third image, that's this one here. This is after a long time when the dye is actually already washing out of the blood vessels. You see that there are locations where the dye has leaked out of the blood vessels. Okay, that's another problem. One sec. Maar. Ja, maar ik ben aan het lesgeven. Ik wil je straks terug. Sorry about that. So here we have leakage of that dye out of the blood vessels, and that's a clear indication that there's something wrong with this patient. What you can see now is three lines, line 1, line 2, and line 3. And these are areas where we took an OCT cross-section, and then we can take a look at what's wrong with that retina. And I hope you will appreciate that this retina looks significantly different from a healthy retina that I've shown you before. For instance, in this area, we see a strongly scattering area. It's a blood cloth. We see little bumps in the pigment layer, like here, and we see in this location a clear area. Oops, in C, where basically there's fluid building up in the retina. This is the most interesting picture of the three. You can see that fluid membrane has increased in size, but we also see a splitting into two layers, right at the location where I put my laser pointer. And this is typical of this disease. You get a growth of new blood vessels, and these blood vessels are not as good as the normal ones. They're leaky, and it's right in this area below the RPE that these blood vessels are expected to grow. And what we see in this OCT now is we see the presence of this blood vessel layer that should not be there. So we have like visual evidence of the presence of that layer. The other thing that is interesting is here. So that fluid that is building up in the retina actually separates the photoreceptors, where I point at right now, from the retinal pigmented epithelium that is right here. The oxygen supply to the photoreceptor is by diffusion from this deeper layer. This is a very blood-rich layer, and oxygen diffuses to the photoreceptors. You can imagine now that in this area here, where there's no fluid membrane, that's a very short distance, so oxygen gets to the photoreceptors. But you can also imagine that in this area where the distance increases and the supply is through diffusion, that these photoreceptors are starving. We don't know what's happening here, but in this location, we don't see the photoreceptors anymore. And we don't know if this patient actually did recover vision in this region after treatment, because this patient was treated with a new medication that actually reduces the fluid buildup, and finally that retina will be attached again to the retinal pigmented epithelium. The last image is an image in the periphery, location 3, where you see beautifully that fluid membrane and also the photoreceptors that are still present over the full length of this fluid membrane that is built up in the retina. Okay, with that, I would like to conclude my lecture, where in my next lecture it will be separate between the two groups, where in the technology light and in the technology group, or MNW, I will show you an example of we will show more examples of what OCT can do in the different diseases. And for the physics group, I will go into detail in advanced OCT technologies like Doppler imaging and polarization imaging. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. It's been a very long sit. I hope you managed to follow it for the full 4 hours. If you have any questions, this is your opportunity. No? Okay, thanks again.
Dankjewel, Johannes. Wil je mij de pdf's nog even sturen? Dan kan
Ja,
ik die
ik ga ze nu maken en dan stuur ik ze naar je toe.
Perfect, dankjewel.
Oké.
Fijn
Oké,
weekend.
ciao.
Doei doei.
Goed weekend allemaal.